Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm one of the co-directors of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here today, those of you who are joining us live, as well as those of you who are watching the video afterwards, for joining us for the first in our 2022 midterm seminar series. There's going to be 4 of these events starting this week, and then each week at the same time for the next 4 weeks leading up to the US 2022 midterm elections. Our goal here is to bring together leading scholars to present new and in-progress research on the intersections of social media, politics, and democracy, which coincidentally is what we study here at the Center for Social, part of what we study here at the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU. Today's conversation is going to focus on news exposure online, on media consumption, and on the spread of misinformation in both English and Spanish, and the effects of partisan media on viewers' beliefs and attitudes. So it's a lot to cover in a 1-hour time, but we are incredibly fortunate to have 3 scholars who've joined us here for 10-minute presentations from excellent scholars in the field. We're going to start with Magdalena Wojcieszak from UC Davis. She'll be followed by Yale's Joshua Kalla, and then finally CSMAP's own Jonathan Nagler, my co-director of CSMAP, will be presenting work as well. I'm going to turn it over now to our moderator for this seminar, who is Homa Hosemardi. Homa is an associate research scientist in the Computational Social Science Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research utilizes advances in computational methods to study misleading and biased information, political radicalization and algorithmic bias on online platforms, and misbehavior on online social networks. She's also the co-author of Quantifying Partisan News Diets and Web and TV Audiences, which was published in July 2022 in Science Advances, and Examining the Consumption of Radical Content on YouTube, published in 2021 on PNAS. You'll note that we have the Q&A button down below, which you can use to ask questions, and you can do this at any time during the presentation, so when the panelists are presenting as well as afterwards. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Homa. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks, Joshua. Hi, everyone. We have a very exciting lineup of presentation for the next 30 minutes. And after that, hopefully we will have a productive discussion. As Joshua mentioned, we have a mix of interesting presentation across different mediums, TV as a more traditional source, online text space, and also a social media platform across different countries, across different languages. So it would be a very holistic view at the information ecosystem. So here we will start with our first speaker, which is Magdalena Wojcieszak. She is a professor of communication at University of California, Davis, and associate researcher at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research at University of Amsterdam. She directs the European Research Council grant ERC EXPO, and her research focuses on selection of news and political information in the current media environment and on information effect on individuals' socio-political outcomes. And today she will present her recent work, which is titled as No Polarization From Partisan News, published in International Journal of Press and Politics, and another work related to news exposure online. Thanks, Magdalena. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So, okay. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this great series. So as Homa mentioned, I will present 2 projects. I will speak pretty fast, and I'm presenting also on behalf of my wonderful co-authors who are listed here. So we all know that many people fear that unprecedented choice in the media leads to exposure to congenial outlets, which in turn leads to unprecedented polarization. So many of us examine partisan news and echo chambers and misinformation, and foundations, as we also know, fuel millions of dollars to studying these topics. But do partisan media in fact polarize? So evidence is rather mixed. So some survey-based work finds associations, but we know that self-reports of news use are often unreliable. This work is often correlational. And experiments do find significant effects of partisan news exposure on polarization. But most designs, even the improved ones that allow for some content selection, are far removed from actual exposure contexts where people can use nearly unlimited sources. And recent field experiments, and you will hear one of them, actually find no polarizing effects of partisan media in more realistic online settings. But again, Josh will talk about Fox detox that did depolarize, people who agreed to take such detox, so presumably not the most strong conservatives. So in this first project I will present, we use online traces combined with survey measures from the same participants to offer evidence on overtime effects of observed, not experimentally induced, exposure on polarization. We compare polarization among strong and weak partisans and test also if centrist outlets polarize strong partisans who should be most prone to polarization. And lastly, and importantly, we explore polarizing effects from both exposure to news domains, which, as we know, comprise articles on sports or travel, and also to hard news, or articles classified as political in these domains using machine learning. So very briefly, as I want to present two projects, we combined two studies, one on a smaller sample recruited using Facebook ads, and the other from my ERC EXPO grant. We analyzed two waves, 3 months apart, in each study, and I will happily discuss the details later. But importantly, to get people's browsing data, we used Web Historian, which is our open source tool. Here are the screenshots. And it accesses people's browser history stored on their computers up to 90 days and displays it to them using interactive visualizations, such as a network graph of websites, word cloud of search terms used, and so forth. And after reviewing their data, people can submit the data to the study. And Web Historian is great, not only because it's open source, can be adjusted to multiple languages, but also it uses a found data approach. So it collects data that are already on people's computers. Unlike the dominant data creation approach, where people have to install a tracker and their data are collected going forward in time, which can lead to attrition, so fewer data collected during the study, and change in people's behaviors. So in total, we had over 43 million visits. We matched the visited domains to identifiable news domains from our extensive and open source lists. We created behavioral measures of exposure to left, right, and centrist news using existing scores. And to determine hard news exposure within news, we trained a well-performing BERT classifier. And as outcomes, we tested attitude polarization on a range of different policies and also affective polarization using multiple standard indicators. Again, I can discuss the details later. Oh, this is not very clear, sorry, but what do we find? We find absolutely nothing. So online exposure to partisan news, as you see in the first panel, did not exacerbate attitude or affective polarization in the aggregate, nor among the Democrats or Republicans. So it wasn't the case, in other words, that congenial partisan exposure produced greatest effects. And we find no effects among strong partisans who should be most likely to polarize, and also exposure to hard news in partisan domains yielded the same nulls as exposure to partisan domains in general. And these results were remarkably similar across both studies. So why is that? So most people, as we find, do not read news, period. In our data during 6 months, visits to news sites comprised less than 2% of browsing. And partisan news are even a smaller drop, less than 1%. And only 0.4 of all visits, 0.4% were to hard news, right? So those are very low numbers. And we know that many citizens do see news as boring. They are averse to politics and they avoid news. And recent work finds that news exposure, and Homa's work here as well, online, on mobile, and on social media is very limited. And news exposure is greater on TV, but it's still vastly outnumbered by other categories of programs. So citizens do not consume the good Polcom broccoli. They clearly prefer, pepperoni pizza. So this is democratically problematic, right? But also puts in perspective the narratives about the powerful effects of partisan media. It also suggests that the persisting focus on news is missing huge parts of online activities of a majority of citizens. And it inaccurately portrays the consumption of political content online. So our focus in the second project I will briefly present is on pizza with broccoli, so to speak. So citizens encountering political content in sites about celebrity gossips, for instance. So we know that internet facilitates exposure to politics in non-news sites, as seen here. So we assess the prevalence of exposure to political content outside news and compare it to news domain exposure and to hard news exposure in people's browsing. We rely on my ERC EXPO data from 3 countries, the US, the Netherlands, and Poland. And large samples in these countries took 3 surveys, 3 months apart, and shared with us their online data using Web Historian. Okay. From about 120 million visits per participants, we matched the visited domain to identifiable news domains as determined by our lists. We also, and that's important, identified YouTube channels, Facebook pages, and Twitter handles of all news media and assigned these exposures accordingly as well as news. And to categorize the visits to news and non-news domains as related to politics, we developed a multilingual classifier. Again, I'm happy to discuss the details. So during 9 months across 3 countries, visits to news sites comprised an average of 3.4% of browsing, with some between country variations, the US being the lowest. And most people do not go to news sites for politics. More visits, 56% on average, were to non-political articles in news, such as recipes or weather. So 96.6% of what people saw in their browsing, in their online data, was not news, and most news were not hard news. But an unexpected silver lining, very briefly, across the countries, 1.6% of visits to non-news sites were to content related to politics. So given the immense popularity of non-news websites, in absolute terms, exposure to politics outside news was greater than exposure to politics in news pages. So what does it mean? So essentially, the political comment poli-sci broccoli is not very popular. There are very few visits to news domains and more political visits outside news sites than in news. So out of every 10 visits to political content, according to our classifier, 3 came from news and 7 from non-news websites. And exposure to partisan media, which is even more limited, had no polarizing effects in our data. And this is not to say that partisan media are not problematic. They may have a range of overtime effects we didn't capture, promote misperceptions, and so forth. But also methodologically, these findings together beg the question as to whether we have enough signal in our data sets. So my initial interest was in dissimilar content and its effects. So we have classifiers to categorize news content about various issues, immigration, abortion, and so forth. We started on an issue ideology classifier to identify whether news about abortion or immigration is more left or right. But if exposure to news is 3%, right, exposure to news about a specific policy is even less. And this similar exposure is likely non-existent. Right? So do we have enough signal only focusing on these small, tiny slices of people's overall information ecology? So we need to account for other types of political content outside news, outside explicitly political websites, its political leaning, the characteristics of the users, and so forth. And also, and these are my current projects, we may think about how to incentivize exposure to quality verified news to hopefully make citizens better informed and as a result, more resilient to misinformation, populist rhetoric, and other hyper-partisan content. So thank you, that's all from me, a little bit over time and fast, but I hope it was good and I look forward to your questions. There are also some publicly available resources on our GitHub. Okay.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. It's very interesting, and we will get back. I have so many questions. We will get back to it after the next two talks. So the next speaker would be Joshua Kalla. He's an assistant professor of political science at Yale University. With a secondary appointment as assistant professor of statistics and data science, his research studies political persuasion, prejudice reduction, and decision-making among voters and political elites, primarily through the use of randomized field experiment. He will present a working paper titled as The Impact of Selective Partisan Media Exposure, a Field Experiment with the Fox News Viewers. Please, thank you, Joshua.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Homa, and thank you all for joining this panel, and thanks to the NYU folks for putting this together. So as Homa mentioned, I'll be presenting some work on cable TV news. So not on online news or social media, but more traditional cable news related to Fox News and CNN. And as Magdalena cited, and as Homa has worked on, lots of Americans still watch cable news and rely on cable news to learn about politics. But in this paper, what we're trying to study is this broad question, similar to Magdalena, of whether or not selective exposure to cable news matters. And by selective exposure, what we mean is that it's the idea that Democrats tend to watch Democratic news like CNN or MSNBC, and Republicans tend to watch more right-leaning news like Fox News. And there's a lot of work on this question of whether selective exposure has an influence in American politics. A lot of work on social media and other types of media, but specifically within the realm of cable news, there tends to be skepticism that this type of selective exposure matters. And the reason why is that the type of person who is a Democrat and watches a lot of MSNBC, or a Republican and watches a lot of Fox News, they're a kind of unique, weird person. They're someone who tends to be very political, very polarized already. And the idea that if we were just to introduce them to some cross-cutting sources, if we were to take that Democrat who watches a lot of Fox News and get them to watch, a Democrat who watches a lot of MSNBC and get them to watch Fox News instead, it probably won't change their mind, is what the skepticism says, because these people are already so polarized, they're already so politicized. In fact, there's some work suggesting it might even lead to backfire. And you can ask yourself this question of, you as someone who's on this call, you probably care a lot about politics. You're probably a strong partisan. You probably watch a lot of CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. Ask yourself that if you're to watch the other side's network, would that make you more open to their perspective? Would that make you, if you're a Democrat who watches MSNBC, would that make you more conservative if you watch a lot of Fox News instead? Or would it just make you angrier? So where do you fall within this question of, does selective exposure matter? So what we do in this study is we try to answer this question. We take people who, in this particular study, are currently heavy viewers of Fox News, and we get them to have that cross-cutting exposure. We introduce them to CNN for a month. So we take people who are selectively exposed to Fox News, reduce that selective exposure, and we see what that does to their political attitudes. And there are a lot of details in the paper, and this is only a short talk, so I'll only get into some of the key findings. But at a high level, what we do is we start with getting data from a media analytics company that has actual data from modern smart TVs on who watches Fox News. So thanks to internet connected devices that let you watch YouTube or Netflix directly from your TV without an Apple TV or any other external device, because of these internet connected devices, we're able to get data on who actually turns on and watches lots of Fox News. So we got this data from a media analytics company, and then we sent these people a letter in the mail inviting them to participate in academic research and to participate in an online survey. So they got this letter in the mail, they went online, they took the survey that the letter directed them to, and they answered a whole lot of questions, including questions about their media exposure. So we could confirm that these people not only have this behavioral data on watching Fox News, but also self-report watching Fox News to us as well. And then in a second baseline survey, we asked them if they would be willing to watch CNN instead during the times when they otherwise typically watch Fox News. And we told them that we would pay them $15 an hour during the primetime hours, the weeknight evening hours, to watch CNN rather than Fox News. And among the people who agreed to that proposition, we flipped a coin essentially and randomly assigned them either to a treatment group that was given these incentives or to a control group that received none of these incentives and just went about life as they normally do. And we enforced whether or not people in the treatment group were watching CNN when they told us they were going to watch CNN by sending them pop quizzes every week, where we would ask them questions like, on tonight's Anderson Cooper, who was interviewed? Was it Gavin Newsom, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris? Easy questions that if you were watching the show, you would quickly be able to answer it. But if you weren't watching the show, you'd be unlikely to know the answer to that type of pop quiz question. And we find that people overwhelmingly answer these pop quizzes correctly. They overwhelmingly complied with watching CNN rather than Fox News. So during this 4-week period, we moved people who normally watch about 6 hours of Fox News to instead watching 6 hours of CNN during this time. At the end of this 4-week period, we then conducted a survey to see how their attitudes changed right away. And then 2 months later, we went back to them with a second survey to see whether there was any long-term change, both in their media viewership habits and then also in their political attitudes as well. And you might wonder, who are these people who are heavy Fox News viewers, yet are willing to be paid to participate in a Yale study to watch CNN instead? Turns out they're not that different from the people who refuse to participate in this type of study. So the people who participate in this study, they overwhelmingly love Donald Trump and they overwhelmingly hate CNN. So here are just some highlights of kind of the demographics of these people. There's much more in the paper, but we asked them on this 0 to 100 feeling thermometer scale, how warmly or coolly do you feel towards Donald Trump? The median was about a 90 for Donald Trump. They really, really love Donald Trump. While for CNN, the median was a 1. It was at the way end tail of that feeling thermometer. We also asked them if they would enjoy watching CNN on a 1 to 6 scale. And the median respondent, again, was a 1, the lowest on that scale. So the kinds of people who participate in this study, it's not like they're heavy Fox News viewers, but they're open to or curious about CNN. Nope, they really hated CNN, yet they're willing to be paid $15 to do this. And they hated CNN and loved Donald Trump just as much as the people who refuse to participate in the study. We really don't see any differences, despite the weirdness of this study. So this study was all done in September 2020. And I think it's important to understand the context of how CNN and Fox News were different during September 2020. So this slide shows the top 10 most popular topics that CNN was discussing during those primetime shows during the weeknight. The most popular topic on Fox News, on CNN, was about Trump's failures to protect the US and his supporters from COVID-19. CNN also spent a lot of time talking about the severity of COVID-19, how racism is a problem in the United States, and how mail-in voting is secure for the 2020 election, topics that Fox News barely broached in their coverage. On the other hand, Fox News spent a lot of time talking about the racial protests that were taking place in America over the summer and early fall of 2020, trying to tie Joe Biden and Democrats more broadly to the more extreme views of these racial protests, focusing on the negative consequences, such as the violence or property damage from these protests, and also a decent bit trying to downplay the severity of COVID-19. Again, topics that Fox News focused heavily on and that CNN barely broached. So by moving people from watching Fox News to CNN during this time period, there's getting a much different view of what's happening in the world, what are facts about COVID-19, what are facts about race in America, racial protests in America. People are learning very, very different sets of facts about the world, depending on which network they're watching, which treatment or control group they're in. So what happens? What happens to the people who at baseline were heavy Fox News viewers, but through these incentives, we got them to watch 4 weeks of CNN instead? What happens to their political views compared to the people in the control group who receive no such incentives? First, we find that what issues they view as important, what political scientists refer to as agenda setting, we see major shifts in this type of outcome, where the people in the treatment group are less likely to agree that violent protests are more important than COVID-19 for the president to focus on. So moving people from Fox News to CNN gets them to care more about COVID-19 and less about the violence from racial protests. They also become more liberal in their beliefs and perceptions of events that were taking place during this time. So, for example, they were less likely to agree than the control group that if Joe Biden is elected, protests will get more violent and more police will be shot. This was something that Fox News heavily covered, heavily discussed, that because they were no longer exposed to Fox News, they weren't hearing that argument, they weren't hearing that information, and thus were less likely to believe it. Similarly, CNN talked a lot about how Donald Trump was not taking safety precautions around COVID-19 at his rallies during the fall election. And the treatment group was therefore less likely to think that Donald Trump was taking safety precautions at his rallies. We also have multiple measures of people's beliefs and actions and viewpoints around COVID-19. And we find that people who we induce to watch CNN rather than Fox News end up taking COVID-19 much more seriously than the control group that remains watching Fox News. They also learn more about Donald Trump's political positions, again, something that CNN was covering, but Fox News barely broached. They believe less misinformation about Joe Biden's political positions. So something that Fox News discussed a bit during this time period was they tried to insinuate that Joe Biden supports defunding the police, something that Joe Biden, both at the time and currently, does not support. But by moving people from watching Fox News to instead watching CNN, they were less likely to believe this type of misinformation about Joe Biden. They became more liberal about some issues, or more moderate about some issues that CNN was covering. For example, they became more supportive of voting by mail during the 2020 election. And they also became more negative in their evaluations of Donald Trump. So again, these are people who at baseline, they're heavy conservatives or strong Republicans. They really like Donald Trump. They plan on voting for Donald Trump in the 2020 election. But by moving them from watching Fox News to CNN, they start to evaluate Trump's handling of COVID-19, the 2020 election, different traits about Donald Trump. They start to evaluate him more negatively. They don't become Democrats, they don't become Biden supporters, but they at least become more willing to state that Donald Trump might be failing on certain dimensions and on certain issues. Finally, they start to recognize that perhaps Fox News is not sharing the full story or is not covering all events that are happening in America and globally that might be important. So we asked them this question: if Donald Trump did something bad, would Fox News discuss it? Do you agree or disagree with that? And this treatment group who starts watching CNN rather than Fox News, they become less likely to believe that Fox News would actually hold Donald Trump accountable and cover the bad things that he did. So they become a bit more skeptical of Fox News's coverage. On the other hand, they don't like CNN anymore. They, again, hated CNN at the baseline, and they remain hating CNN after having watched it for 4 weeks. And I think this open-ended survey response we got really summarizes it well, where this respondent told us, you have to watch some of all the lying ... media to get anything resembling the whole story. So again, they recognize that there are shortcomings of both of these networks. However, when we go back to these people 2 months after we stop paying them, we find for the most part, their habits don't change. They go back to watching Fox News and for the most part, stop watching CNN. There might be a bit of an effect on some coverage of CNN, but for the most part, they return to watching Fox News fairly heavily. And as a result, their political attitudes return to match the control group. We really see no lasting differences between the treatment or control group after we remove those incentives. So what do we find? So first, I think this is pretty strong evidence that, at least in this context of cable TV news, that selective exposure matters. that if we're able to take people who are currently selectively exposed, who currently are heavy Fox News viewers in this case, and get them to engage with cross-cutting media such as CNN, it results in them learning new information and having more moderate political attitudes. Second, I think this study casts some doubt on some of the work on partisan motivated reasoning, which suggests that people should be unwilling to update, unwilling to learn information that is bad for their partisan side. Yet here we find that these Republicans, these Fox News viewers, they're willing to learn information from CNN, and they're willing to absorb what CNN is saying, even though they told us they don't trust CNN, they don't like CNN, and they know that CNN is cheerleading for the other side. And finally, more normatively, I think this demonstrates how the fact that partisan media is hiding information from their voters can undermine some of the democratic accountability that we care about. So as the kind of content analysis of what was taking place during this time shows, Fox News was undermining coverage of COVID-19. And this has important implications, most likely for how Donald Trump, for example, performed on COVID-19, the kinds of actions that he was taking. So this really shows that partisan media can exercise some serious power because the viewers of partisan media tend to typically watch just their side's media. And by limiting what facts and information people know, it undermines our ability to hold our elected officials accountable. So thank you all. As I said, there's a lot more in the paper, and hope folks will give it a read.
Thank you so much. So because we are a little behind, I will just quickly go to introducing Jonathan, and then we will get back to questions at the end, which I have so many questions for you, Joshua, as well. So our next speaker is Jonathan Neckler. He is a co-director of NYU Center for Social Media and Politics and professor of politics and affiliated faculty at Center of Data Science at New York University. His research focused on voting and elections and the role of social media as well as traditional media in politics. And today he will present findings from an independent panel project which examines media consumption, discussion of political issues, and the spread of information in both English and Spanish in the lead up to the 2022 US elections. Thank you, Jonathan. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me try to get my screen shared with the right moment. Okay, so I believe everyone can see what I'm sharing. So there's a large set of people on this. To introduce them super briefly, Aaron is the project manager, Robert is our data scientist. He's probably the only person I should need to introduce because he's also a recent Stony Brook PhD and he's on the job market. Egwin is a software engineer in the lab. Marissa Abrahano is a professor of political science at UCSD, basically serving as a co-PI in this project along with myself. And Mariana Garcia is a PhD student at UCSD. And then Josh is the co-director here at CSMAP. This is work in very preliminary stages in the sense that, like, we are in the field today. But we do have results. We're in the field with wave 2. We do have wave 1. So we're interested in studying Hispanic media consumption and political attitudes. And the goal here is we wanted to recruit a representative panel of Hispanic respondents across 3 language groups: English dominant, bilingual, Spanish dominant. We have a non-Hispanic, essentially control group. And we're interested in measuring their self-reported media consumption, but we also wanted to incentivize respondents to share directly social media activity and online media consumption. So we've asked them to provide a Twitter handle, to install a web browser plugin, to share Facebook data. And so we hope to get a very rich picture of their online behavior and consumption, as well as survey them about political attitudes. So we started in March 29th of 2022 with both English and Spanish language ads. This is not a typo. We finished recruitment July 25th. We filtered for selective characteristics along the way with this goal of trying to end up with a representative sample. These are the survey ads we ran, obviously 1 English, 1 Spanish. Just a point of information, you might notice it says you have the opportunity to make up to $140. We wanted to sort of let people know, hey, this is a long panel. If you opt in, you really could stay with us for a long time. That has pros and cons as a recruitment strategy, but that's where we are. It leads to some data quality issues I'm going to I just want to briefly mention these. The reason, by the way, what motivated us to do this, to recruit our own panel this way, is we felt by not having a survey firm in between us and the respondents, we had more ability to ask them to provide digital trace data. It meant that we didn't, we were essentially controlling PII. There wasn't a survey firm between us. But so it meant we had to do all this work. Data quality. If you say you're going to pay people, you need to worry about catching bad actors. You need to catch inattentive respondents. To give you an idea of the scope of the problem, we had almost 20,000 survey responses of some form. By the time we filtered things, we are down to 4,006 valid survey responses that we believe are okay. And most invalidated responses, I want to point out, they're not based on the survey response themselves. They're based on forensics about the respondent. I can't reveal here all the things we do because I don't want to tell all the bad actors out there listening how we catch them. But there are certain simple things like we didn't accept things coming in from VPNs. You sort of look for duplicate emails. And one brief note: about 2/3 of our respondents took the survey on a mobile device. So this becomes a big issue when you think about, oh, we're going to install a web tracker. This is going to be great, but our web tracker only works on desktops. So there are it remains quite an adventure actually gathering digital trace data. But here's where we end up. We end up with 2,636 self-identified Hispanic or Latinx respondents. They were given a pretty standard ethnicity question where they were basically able to say, do you consider yourself Hispanic or Latinx, Latina? And so these are folks who self-identify this way. We both ask them their primary language at home, and that's where these 3 rows come from. But we've done additional work in wave 2. We actually essentially gave them a reading test to see, like, hey, these people who said that they, are Spanish language speakers, are they really? Can they do more than take our survey? And some Spanish language speakers choose to take the survey in English, which was a surprise to us. So I want to talk briefly about what we got. So here's just the education breakdown, the total sample, whites, Hispanics. And I also want to show how this breaks down by language use. It's a bit different. A key thing to note here is our Hispanic sample is incredibly overeducated. You'll notice that we have about 3% with no high school degree. According to the ACS, this should be somewhere around 25%. And this is kind of no surprise to anyone who does surveys. It's very hard to get these folks. Sort of comforting that 7% of our Spanish speakers, no high school degree. Also, if you look over here, we have way too many people with a 4-year college degree or postgraduate degree. The good news, bad news is you can deal with some of this by waiting, but no, there's no magic waiting trick that deals with the fact that we just don't have enough folks without a high school degree. So we will be back to the drawing board on that. Age is also challenging, not quite as difficult. We essentially end up with way too many folks in like the 25 to 44-year-old range among the set of Hispanics. We should have about 43% there, and we've got about 64% of our sample is here. And that'll be reflected in some things on social media use down the road. And also, not surprising, we have trouble getting enough really old folks. I shouldn't say really old. I didn't mean that. Folks over 55, we just don't get enough of those people. Okay, so let's talk about reported social media use. Here, where I'm just doing a very simple comparison, and this is unweighted, so I'll talk about what changes if you correct this for the weights. But I want to point out some of the bigger things that we see here. So here, I'm just comparing all whites and all Hispanics, and to give you, some take on some of the big differences. Hispanics use WhatsApp way more than Anglos. And even if when we weight this, it stays qualitatively similar. The Hispanic, if you weight this, the Hispanic percentage on WhatsApp, I think actually went up a little bit, but it remains, I'm sorry, WhatsApp for Hispanics don't change. What does change is the Facebook one. When you weight by age, if you remember, we had that weird group of Hispanics, way too many 25 to 44-year-olds. When you correct for that, Facebook use for Hispanics goes way down. So Hispanics actually use Facebook considerably less than Anglos, but WhatsApp much more. They also use Telegram much more. And it's not trivial. Like 25% of Hispanics are on Telegram. Okay, that's more than what we think is the overall population on Twitter. Okay, we asked here, now the one question is, okay, why are they on WhatsApp? And one idea is, well, maybe they're on the WhatsApp because they all have friends abroad and everybody abroad uses WhatsApp. But when we asked them how frequently do you talk about politics, Hispanics talk about politics on WhatsApp more than Anglos talk about politics on WhatsApp. So it's not like they're on WhatsApp just to talk to folks in other countries, unless they're talking to them about politics, which would be of interest to us anyway. So this is kind of an interesting finding. It's also, as everyone who studies social media knows, a challenging finding because, so Hispanics are on a platform that is very hard to study. That's where one of the facts of life. So what we're interested in then is, okay, we wanted to know about misinformation. Hispanics are in a different media environment because lots of these folks are in a media environment that includes Spanish language. Is there more information, bad information out there in that environment? So we asked a simple question, like, where do you get information about the COVID-19 outbreak? And we gave them a bunch of choices. Some of them you might think are better than others. Most of us think getting your information from health organizations, state officials, national news, probably better than getting it from social media about COVID-19. You'll see that Hispanics get more information about COVID-19 from social media than Anglos do. Something to kind of worry about and something that we'll relate to, we'll talk about in a different way in context about voter fraud in a minute. And it turns out that just without waiting, but just if we condition on demographics, partisanship, socioeconomic status, we get this. Oops, sorry, bad. Oh, that was terrible. One here. We get a really significant effect for Hispanics being much more likely, in this case, the reference group are Anglos, but much more likely than any group to rely on social media for information about COVID-19. And this is a breakdown among Hispanics between the language groups, and it's not driven by the Spanish speakers here. You can see very similar results. Okay, just a couple more slides. So belief in electoral fraud. This question 1 did not have a typo in it. On the survey that went out, we asked Donald Trump has alleged there was fraud in 2020. Who do you think more people really voted for? And we asked him, do you think electoral votes were not awarded to the candidate that most people voted for? And we're trying to find out, okay, what was consuming Spanish language media related to your ability to answer these, to your belief in fraud? And in both of these panels, one for each of the questions, people who consume Spanish language social media are less likely to believe the obviously true statement here that more people voted for Joe Biden, and people who consume more Spanish language social media are much more likely to believe that in at least some states they reported the wrong winner. So clearly consumption of Spanish language media is associated with belief in misinformation. And I notice I have, yeah, so I'll take 30 more seconds, I guess. One other thing we asked, because there is a midterm election coming up, we did ask people in the coming midterm elections, control the House at stake, which best describes your view? And Hispanics overwhelmingly said they favor the Democrats keeping control of the House, about 65% of them. That's a bit more. I didn't talk about our party ID breakdown. That is more than just, the fraction of Democrats in our sample. So it was just sort of an interesting result seeing that, yes, they do seem to strongly favor that. So I'm going to stop there. We've asked loads of questions, about people's attitudes, views on abortion. And so we hope to be able to put out fairly rich findings about Hispanic voters in the months to come. So thank you very much.
Okay, Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all the speakers for their wonderful presentations. So I will start with my questions, and then we will go to question answers. So I think the first question that I had for Magdalena was about the tools that you mentioned, which seems like super interesting and maybe for many of us in our research can be helpful. You mentioned that Web Historian is like a open source tools that we can use like to collect the data afterward, like somehow like collect historical data. And you mentioned some of the benefits like attrition and also like censorship, that because people don't feel they are being observed, maybe they don't censor themselves. But wouldn't it be the same as like if they drop and decide not to upload the data, then you have a 0-1 situation. So instead, but like, and the other question is about censorship. Since they have, like they are aware that they, at the end of the 3-month period, they need to upload. So they have also this in their mind. Also, like I think you mentioned your tools has this feature that people can see what they have done, and then they can actually remove like the things that they don't want to be shared. All this together, doesn't it actually helps more for them to have more, you know, like time and, you know, tools available to them to censor like what they don't want to be shared?
Great, thank you, Homa, for the good questions. So just a couple of things. So Erica mentioned Trevino, who developed the tool, my collaborator from American University. She actually did some work looking at, do people delete, right? Because yes, that's true, people can review their data and delete whatever they do not want to share before submitting the data to the study. And most people do not. We actually, the tool records whether you are deleting something, right? And there's, for most of our purposes, there are no reasons for people to delete, you know, the New York Times or Fox News, right? Most people probably would be deleting some very sensitive sites, such as adult websites, right? So in our data, we have quite a lot of visits to those, right? We did check there was going to be a project. So if people are not deleting their heavy porn viewership, right, it's probably unlikely that they would delete the data that are of interest to us here. And when it comes to behavioral change, right? So the tool collects what's already stored on your computer. I know from conversations with some of us here, right, that if we use, let's say, YouGov Pulse, where participants install the web extension, right, sometimes something happens. There is a change in the provider, right? So there may be issues during data collection, which do not occur if you go back in time and take the data that the people have already stored.
Yes. No, thank you, sir. Thank you very much. It was very clarifying. So you find like, in fact, very small fraction that's removed. So that's a good sign, I see.
Yeah.
I think we had also the observation with like our large panel of observational study. It was about 400,000 users, that like there were a lot of adult websites that was, we had the same perception, that our understanding that perhaps users do not think so much about censoring themselves. Thank you so much. So I think my next question would be for Joshua, that so like it was a very, very interesting design, like to like, you know, to capture like, because like one of the questions that I think like after looking at, okay, there's a lot of studies, what is out there, like whether people are consuming, but the most important question at the end would be, would it have any effect? And as we have seen in recent study that TV is actually like a big source of information, this is very nice that you have shown that like, yes, in fact, like if you have like shift people to watch CNN, it has some short-time impact. But given the fact that like after 2 months, it seems they go back to their habits, what do you think about like the intervention or design for, or suggestion for policymakers, how we can actually, because we have evidence that it will work, but it's like it will fade away as soon as you stop this push. So what are your thoughts on that? Like how we can actually make it happen? And I had one detailed question, but I will ask it after this one.
Yeah, I mean, to use Magdalena's great metaphor, I mean, we're asking people to eat their broccoli and not just their pepperoni pizza. And yeah, I mean, I'm not a policymaker. after we came out with this paper, I talked to a few policymakers, and one of the ideas they had was, what if you just run public service announcements trying to get people to recognize the importance of consuming a diverse media diet? It could work. I'm skeptical. I think, yeah, encouraging broccoli eating is a hard thing to do. Because, I mean, frankly, if you're a Republican, watching Fox News is fun, and watching CNN is not a good experience. I mean, especially during this time period, CNN was very much an anti-Trump network based on, I mean, my observation of watching it. It was, if you're a Trump supporter, I don't think you were going to enjoy watching CNN. So I think one option is to explore ways to have more center-left and center-right networks that, you know, still have that partisan cheerleading, but also filter in a bit of the broccoli that we need. But I think it is a hard ask to get people to totally switch what they're consuming into consuming something that's just not fun for them. So I don't have a good answer for you, but I think it's a challenge.
Yeah. No, actually, it's a big question. It's not something that we may have answer for that. But I think that would be the next big challenge for everybody, is like that, how we can actually bring this culture of viewership. It's something that seems like we need to change from like society's action in terms of news viewership. Okay, I will just skip my second question because we don't have much time and we have more questions. So I will just ask one small question that I have for Jonathan, which is like, you had a very nice study that you showed that like for Spanish speaking is like they are more prone to like false beliefs and believing misinformation. But like you had this comparison with English speaker. One finding, I guess, is that it's because there's less monitoring or less moderation for other languages than English. Is that correct?
I mean, that could be the reason. You know, it's certainly the reasonable conjecture that, you know, they're consuming Spanish language social media and they seem to believe in more misinformation. Whether that's because it's monitored better or there's just an insane amount produced there. And so, you know, even if there's the exact same level of monitoring, you would get this effect. You know, we don't pretend to have measured that or know, but I sort of take it that your conjecture is totally consistent with what we do know about what Facebook says and what most of us believe, that they spend much more time on English language than other languages. You would sort of hope, given that there are a fair number of Spanish speakers in the world, that they could do that one correctly, or, you know, do that one well, but, you know, we don't know.
And then to just relate all these three studies, that like we hear like TV is big, and then to TV we see some effect on people's behavior. For online text space, we have like consumption is a small, the effect is a small, and then you have studied the social media platforms like WhatsApp, which has been also understudied. So in part of your study, you see that there is impact, or like it's more impacting like a Spanish language content, but for English content, the effect is low. So do you think that we can sum up that overall, like for social media platform and online and these other services, still they are not comparable to TV, and then is like, in fact, like they have much smaller effect on people's attitude compared to TV? Can we just summarize it as this, or do you think there's more studies still needed for social media for like English space?
I think if you wanted to talk about it as an average effect, you know, my guess is that's true. If we get into heterogeneous effects, I mean, then it becomes harder because we don't know how many people, you know, are really taking a dive on social media and are being influenced by it. So I don't know that we can, you know, I think it depends exactly how you slice the question.
Yeah, thank you. I will just stop here, and then we'll go to the chat question, so we will have time, so at least for one or two questions. So I think one of the questions that like any of the panelists who can answer is about like, what is the effect of unintentional exposure to partisan news for polarized voters? Like perhaps like unintentionally, like visiting an non-news website. You mentioned, Magdalena, that there are exposure to such content on non-news that can be considered something unintentional. I don't want to go to a news website, but I'm exposed to political content.
Absolutely. So we do know that strong partisans do have very salient, by definition, political identity. So for them, whatever political information can serve as a trigger reinforcing that identity as well, right? And it's kind of what Josh found, however, right now, there were no motivated reason that people did not engage in motivated reasoning in his study to the extent that one could assume, but nevertheless, to the extent that whatever mentions of politics trigger partisan identity because they disseminate elite cues and political cues and so forth, some polarizing effect could occur. Again, many studies are not finding that, so the jury's still out. And again, the strong partisans are those who are more likely to consume partisan news to begin with. So if even if they're intentionally unintentionally encounter politics outside, right, that's probably offset by their pretty heavy partisan diet.
There is also work from cable news where Greg Martin and Ali Yorakuglu have a nice paper where in some areas, Fox News has a lower channel number than CNN does. And they argue this is fairly random in which areas Fox News has a low number and which areas CNN has a low number. And they use this to try and argue that some people are unintentionally being exposed to Fox News because it just has a low cable number. And this is back in the day when you had to use your remote control to like manually click up or down by individual numerical increments. And they find that this unintentional exposure of Fox News, because of it having a lower cable number in some areas than in other areas, does in fact have a polarizing effect. And in particular, it leads to an increase in Republican vote share caused by this unintentional Fox News exposure. So again, depending on whether you're looking at the online space or the offline traditional cable news space, you might get some different results.
I guess we are at 1 hour. Josh, I do want to continue, or like should we?
Yes, yeah, unfortunately, yeah, it's now 1 o'clock. So I just wanted to, before going through 2 things. One is to highlight the fact that this is, as I said, this is the first of 4 series. And so just to let everybody know, we've got these coming up in the next 3 Wednesdays. Next week on October 19th, we'll have Maggie McDonald, Shannon McGregor, and Annalise Russell all presenting on a panel on using social media to drive the political conversation. So I hope to see many of you back next week. And I would like very much to have everyone join me in thanking both Homa for hosting us today, but Josh, Magdalena, and Jonathan for sharing all this research with us. It was a great way to spend I thought it was a great way to spend an hour. I hope to see more of you in the coming weeks here, but thanks so much to all of our participants and for all of you in the audience. So take care, everyone. Bye-bye.